Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Good evening from Downing Street, where we are waiting for the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to make a statement outside Number 10, just at that podium there. Throughout the day, talk of a possible snap general election has been rife across Westminster. Could the Prime Minister be about to call for one? Earlier, Cabinet Ministers were called in for an unexpected meeting. It follows plans by MPs opposed to leaving the EU without a deal to force legislation through the Commons, starting tomorrow. The latest suggestion is to push through a 3-month extension to Brexit to force the Prime Minister to reach a new deal. A number of those intending to vote against the government are Tory rebels, some former cabinet ministers. Developments are coming thick and fast here tonight with the very latest. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
Government's always a work in progress, but there's nothing straightforward about ministers arriving today. This still new cabinet called for an unexpected meeting, prepared to chuck Tory colleagues out of the party if they vote against the Prime Minister this week. Prepared perhaps to call an election if Number 10's on the losing side.
MPs who seek to take power away from their Prime Minister, their party, and hand it to someone else are stepping over a line. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope that everybody recognises that what we need to do now is focus on delivering Brexit.
The threats cranking up the pressure on would-be Tory rebels joining forces with other parties to change the law in days. Westminster's village expecting a showdown of historic proportions as MPs band together to try to make it impossible for the Prime Minister to take us out of the EU without a deal. But will the threats change anything?
No, because my job is to represent my community and I'm going to stand firm in doing that. They're extremely concerned about the damage of no deal to the economy, and I think rather than almost attacking MPs who are representing their constituents' concerns, the better thing to do would be to start addressing those fears properly for a change.
Could dozens of Tory MPs be forced to walk out of their party if they're willing to vote against the Prime Minister on Brexit and defeat him this week?
That is how it now looks, because the government has decided that after many votes on Brexit over the past few years, and with votes from some colleagues who are now in Cabinet not being disciplined, now is the time to exercise discipline, and it looks as though we're in the first wave.
However consumed the Tories are by fighting amongst themselves, however determined the Prime Minister is to force a confrontation, whether it's on Brexit or calling an election, Parliament can say no. Would Jeremy Corbyn celebrate the prospect of an election? A chance at victory? Not so fast. In his shadow cabinet meeting in Salford today and elsewhere, plenty of MPs are suspicious of an election campaign. Labour wants to ensure we never leave without a deal first.
This week could be our last chance. We are working with other parties to do everything necessary to pull our country back from the brink. Then we need a general election.
We'll regard this outcome.
A voice from Labour's past has already warned the opposition. A quick poll before Brexit Day at the end of October could simply be a decoy from Number 10.
Jeremy Corbyn has behaved responsibly, and if he continues to put country first, he will benefit the country and himself. He can now play a decisive role in how Brexit develops. But he should see an election before Brexit is decided for the elephant trap that it is.
Downing Street might have welcomed its newest resident today, a rescue dog adopted by the Prime Minister and his partner. But how long he and his owners call this home may soon be a question that's answered by us all.
Well, we're still waiting for the Prime Minister to come out and talk to us from his podium outside Number 10. I'm joined by our political editor, Laura Koonsberg. So, Laura, what have you been hearing?
Well, things have moved very, very quickly today, Fiona, and I'm sure our viewers might remember when he was standing to be Prime Minister, Boris Johnson always said that he didn't want to
interrupt you. Let's hear what he's got to say.
5 weeks ago, I spoke to you from these steps and said that this government was not going to hang around and that we would not wait until Brexit Day, October the 31st, to deliver on the priorities of the British people. And so I'm proud to say that on Wednesday, Chancellor Sajid Javid is going to set out the most ambitious spending round for more than a decade. I said I wanted to make your streets safer, and that is why we are recruiting another 20,000 police officers. I said I wanted to improve your hospital and reduce waiting times at your GP, and so we are doing 20 new hospital upgrades in addition to the 34 billion more going into the NHS. And I said I wanted every child in this country to have a superb education. That's why I announced last week that we are levelling up funding across the country and spending much more next year in both primary and secondary schools. And it's to push forward this agenda on these and many other fronts that we need a Queen's speech in October, while leaving due time to debate Brexit and other matters. And as we come to that Brexit deadline, I am encouraged by the progress we are making. In the last few weeks, the chances of a deal have been rising, I believe, for three reasons. They can see that we want a deal. They can see that we have a clear vision for our future relationship with the EU, something that has not always perhaps been the case. And they can see that we are utterly determined to strengthen our position by getting ready to come out regardless, come what may. But if there's one thing that can hold us back in these talks, it is the sense in Brussels that MPs may find some way to cancel the referendum, or that tomorrow MPs will vote with Jeremy Corbyn for yet another pointless delay. I don't think they will. I hope that they won't. But if they do, they will plainly chop the legs out from under the UK position and make any further negotiation absolutely impossible. And so I say, to show our friends in Brussels that we are united in our purpose, MPs should vote with the government against Corbyn's pointless delay. I want everybody to know there are no circumstances in which I will ask Brussels to delay. We're leaving on the 31st of October, no ifs or buts. We will not accept any attempt to go back on our promises or scrub that referendum. And armed and fortified with that conviction, I believe we will get a deal at that crucial summit in October, a deal that Parliament will certainly be able to scrutinise. And in the meantime, let's let our negotiators get on with their work without that sword of Damocles over their necks and without an election. Without an election. I don't want an election. You don't want an election. Let's get on with the people's agenda. Fighting crime, improving the NHS, boosting schools, cutting the cost of living, unlocking talent and opportunity across the entire United Kingdom with infrastructure, education and technology. It is a massive agenda. Let's come together and get it done, and let's get Brexit done by October the 31st. Thank you very much.
What happens if you will be? What happens if you move? They've made it clear that there will be.
Well, we heard Boris Johnson talking there. There was much speculation that he was going to call for a snap general election. Those are not the words that we heard. Laura Cuso, what did you make of that?
Well, they're not, but it was fascinating this week there. We had in the last few minutes, we heard Boris Johnson make absolutely plain that he will not accept Brexit being delayed any further. Why does that matter? Because Downing Street is worried that this week MPs will win their bid to extend Brexit rather than leave without a deal. And my understanding is that while Boris Johnson was at pains there to say that he doesn't want a general election, Downing Street is willing to call a rapid election with a date possibly being October the 14th if MPs defeat the government this week.
So what do you think stopped him announcing that now?
Well, I think Boris Johnson does not want it to seem as if he wants a general election. He couldn't have been more plain about that. They want, I believe, this week to be able to point the finger at MPs blocking Brexit as they would conceive of it in number 10. And they want to be able to say to the public, look, we were forced into this. But wasn't it a fascinating and confusing piece of political choreography? Because very senior sources in there are indicating that the plan is to have a rapid election if Number 10 finds itself on the losing side in Parliament this week. But he is not ready to say that yet. The government is not ready to say that publicly, even though behind the scenes that is exactly what has been indicated to us, and even a date of October the 14th has been suggested.
Well, actually, it was quite hard to hear what he was saying here in Down Street, because the protests down at the entrance of Down Street are so loud, protests against what Mr. Johnson is planning. How do you think what he had to say is going to go down with Tory MPs who are thinking of introducing legislation tomorrow, as soon as tomorrow, to try and stop him?
Well, I think so far the very aggressive, Downing Street would say forthright, but the very aggressive political tactics that they have been using towards Conservative MPs who want to change the law to stop us leaving without a deal, for most of them actually it's stiffened their spines. They've been saying things to me like, well, so be it, or it's time to put the country before the party. This is a completely different approach to the tack that was taken by Theresa May. You know, on so many occasions we stood here, didn't we, when she was trying almost everything she could to get Brexit done, apart from splitting her party. What Boris Johnson appears willing to do to stick to his Brexit deadline is chuck some Conservatives over the side, maybe even fracture his party. But these circumstances could hardly be more controversial. I'm sure some of our viewers can hear protesters at the gates shouting, "Stop the coup." But Number 10's well aware how divisive this is, but I think rather than try to bring people together, they are maximising what they believe is the reason that Boris Johnson is here, which is to get Brexit done on October the 31st. Whatever happens. But I suspect by the end of the week we might hear another announcement from him announcing that we are indeed going to have a general election, but we'll see.
We shall see, and we will be back, hello, if that happens. Well, let's talk to Katya Adler in Brussels. Just remember, Katya, what are they making of all this over there?
Well, of course, EU leaders are watching very closely what's going on in Westminster. Speculation had been rife that the Prime Minister may call an election, and actually that would be key for EU leaders, because actually the Prime Minister is wrong when he's saying that his main leverage in attempted renegotiations with the EU depends on making a credible no-deal threat. EU leaders believe him, and it's made them sit up and listen, but it's not enough for them to change the withdrawal agreement to make painful concessions. And why is that? Well, because with the numbers that the Prime Minister has in Parliament, he simply cannot guarantee to EU leaders that if they make concessions, that those concessions will mean that a Brexit deal is guaranteed to get through Parliament. Now, if he were to hold a general election before the UK would leave the EU, that could change all of that if he got a majority. He needs simply to persuade EU leaders that their pain would result in their gain, would result in a Brexit deal. Otherwise, they say, why on earth would we make concessions if that Brexit deal still may not pass through Parliament? But even then, Fiona, whether or not an election is called, even those here in the EU who still hold out some hope for a deal, you have to ask, what would that Brexit deal compromise be that would be acceptable to the EU and the UK? So even if an election were to be on the horizon, that magical Brexit deal solution really isn't yet.
Katya Adler in Brussels, thank you. Well, back here in Downing Street, you heard the Prime Minister saying we are leaving the EU on October the 31st. No ifs, no buts in his words, and preparations are continuing. Well, a £100 million public information campaign urging people to make sure they are ready for Brexit has been launched by the government. Print advertisements, social media videos and billboards are going to be rolled out later this week. But how prepared are companies across the country? Our business editor Simon Jack has been finding out.
The UK and the EU's deep trading relationship was on display today at this food fair in London. UK firms are being urged to prepare themselves for a no-deal Brexit as the most expensive government advertising campaign in history was launched this week.
In all the newspapers today, new campaign, they're spending £100 million on this, telling you to get ready for Brexit.
We're not ready and the rest of Europe isn't ready. We're trying to export the moment into Europe, and none of the European distributors will touch us until Brexit's either gone through or not. So it's a really difficult time for us at the moment. We just want some clarity.
I think we're prepared in terms of where we are in the stage of our sort of our business, as I say, is a small startup.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for now, Brexit ready, yes?
Brexit ready, yes. Yeah, bring it on.
Can we have a go?
Yeah,
do you
sure.
want to start it?
For the confused and unprepared, help is at hand. A new online questionnaire generates a company-specific list of things you need to do. Tea merchant Ricky Qatari filled it out, and then we looked at the results.
Set up a duty deferment account to pay your customs duty. Do you have one of those?
No.
No?
A duty deferment account.
Do you even know what that is?
No.
Me neither.
In total, there were 25 steps Ricky needs to take to prepare, some of which the government's website says will take more than 4 weeks. Time Ricky would rather spend in other ways.
Quite scary. The amount of items I've got to look at or potentially employ someone to now work with me on to get these things all resolved in time. We're busy with trade shows and meeting clients, trying to continue with the business. I think this is going to take some time to really go through.
So some businesses here say they've done all they can, others say they feel very underprepared. Most of them frankly don't know whether they're prepared for a no-deal Brexit, but there is a general level of frustration that businesses are being asked to spend time and money on preparing for something that officially the government doesn't even want.
It works really well in food salad.
2 months isn't long, but it's long enough to make a difference, according to the founder of a small business network.
Small businesses have got 2 months to prepare, and one of the big reasons why they haven't been doing any planning up until now is because they haven't known the answers to the questions they had. They didn't know for what they were planning. We still don't, but what the government is saying today is if you have a good fit business, you will be in a much better position to get through Brexit.
The government's £100 million campaign message is simple. When it comes to Brexit preparation, it's crunch time. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Rita, thank you. Yes, welcome back to Downing Street. In the last half hour, we've heard from the Prime Minister about his plans in this crunch week for the Brexit process, urging MPs not to back a Brexit delay. I don't want an election, you don't want an election. That was his message. Well, our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, is here. So, Laura, what do we make of this? There were briefings all afternoon that he was about to call for a snap general election. You were even given a suggested date. Then Boris Johnson comes out and does no such thing.
Because I think the third part of his message was an implied one, which is if those MPs defeat number 10 this week and manage to change the law to extend the Brexit process until the end of January, then he is ready to call that election, and he would do it rapidly, with a likely date being October the 14th. Now, he knows that calling an election would be very controversial in the country. He knows that many of our viewers might be thinking, here we go again, and be cross about that, not least because during his campaign he said that he wouldn't call an early election. So by not explicitly mentioning it, of course he'll have someone to point the finger at if he ends up having to do that later this week, by saying it's MPs in Parliament who've given him no choice and he has to go ahead with it. He also, I suppose, gives him a little bit of wriggle room in order, if he doesn't do that, if he blinks from actually going through with it. But it's very, very clear tonight that as things stand, number 10 thinks that it may well be their best option if and only if they lose in Parliament this week. But with the way things stand, this is not an idle threat, because number 10 knows as things stand, Rebels are likely to win, and it may well be before too long that we are at an election campaign.
So talk us through what's likely to happen tomorrow, because MPs come back after the recess and we're all expecting it to kick off tomorrow.
That's right. I mean, all of this has happened before MPs are even officially back in Westminster. But tomorrow there's going to be a sort of stampede of opposition and some Tory MPs trying to get through an emergency debate. They want to win a vote that would give them control of what happens in the House of Commons. Once they have that control, they want to change the law to say that unless there is a deal with the EU that can get through Parliament by the middle of October, or unless Parliament has changed its mind and approves the idea of leaving the European Union without a formal deal in place, well, if those two things haven't happened, they want this whole process to be extended until the end of January. Now, as far as Boris Johnson is concerned, extension is extinction. That's one of the phrases used by his team, and they will fight tooth and nail ahead of that happening. But the Rebels, this strange alliance of some Tory former ministers, Labour MPs, SNP, Lib Dems, all banding together, they think that they probably have the numbers. So we are absolutely on the point of a really, really dramatic showdown that I think number 10 we're trying to short circuit and go to the country instead.
We shall see. Laura, for the moment, thank you very much indeed.
Prime Minister tonight threw down the gauntlet to his Brexit opponents and potential Tory rebels. Speaking outside Downing Street, Boris Johnson urged MPs to support the government when Parliament resumes for a showdown tomorrow. Opposition parties will try to pass a bill that could prevent a no-deal Brexit, but Mr Johnson said that would make it impossible for him to get a new deal with Brussels. And although the Prime Minister says no one wants a general election, ITV News understands that if the government is defeated, there will be a vote on one. We'll get more on that in just a moment. But first, our political correspondent, Paul Brand, has the very latest from Westminster.
This was the Prime Minister making a statement tonight in more ways than one, drawing the limelight to warn MPs about casting a shadow on his plans and refusing to be drowned out by protest.
I say to show our friends in Brussels that we are united in our purpose. MPs should vote with the government against Corbyn's pointless delay. I want everybody to know there are no circumstances in which I will ask Brussels to delay. We're leaving on the 31st of October, no ifs or buts.
And if it requires an election, well, there was a hint at that, even if he sounded reluctant.
And in the meantime, let's let our negotiators get on with their work without that sword of Damocles over their necks and without an election. Without an election. I don't want an election. You don't want an election. Let's get on with the people's agenda.
But tonight, MPs published their own agenda, a bill giving the government a deadline of the 19th of October to either reach a deal with the EU and let Parliament vote on it, or ask MPs to approve no deal. If neither condition is met, the bill demands a 3-month delay to Brexit to the end of January. Among those who could back it, around 20 Tory rebels, with the threat that it might be one of the last moves they make. The party could deselect them as Tory candidates. Are you prepared to lose your job in order to stop a no-deal Brexit?
Well, I know that my constituents' jobs are at risk with a no-deal Brexit, and to my mind, I am prepared to lose my job in order to protect theirs.
Tonight, the Prime Minister was trying to get MPs drunk on loyalty, inviting them to a garden party at Downing Street. What do you make of all this talk of purging the party of his own critics?
This isn't an issue of purging anyone. This is
deselecting them.
This is an issue of discipline being imposed by the Prime Minister.
I'm backing his stance to try and get the EU to move in terms of the backstop so that we can vote for the amended withdrawal agreement and get all this sorted.
You up for an election?
Absolutely. If Parliament cannot follow the instructions of the British people, then the British people deserve an opportunity to change their Parliament.
Earlier, the Cabinet had met to discuss the Prime Minister's plan. The question is whether the opposition will play along with it. Today, Jeremy Corbyn seemed clear he would back an election.
When a government finds itself without a majority, the solution is not to undermine democracy. The solution is to let the people decide and call a general election. It is the people, not an unelected Prime Minister, who should determine our country's future.
Today's events almost overshadowed the arrival of the Downing Street dog, a rescue puppy named Dylan, meaning loyalty. The Prime Minister will need a bit of it, or he too could be rehomed. Paul Brand, ITV News, Westminster.
OK, well, as Paul said, this is the start of a pivotal week for the Prime Minister, the party, and indeed Brexit. Well, tomorrow MPs return from their summer break and they're set for a showdown in the House of Commons. Opposition leaders, with the help of some Conservative rebels, are set to ask the Speaker for an emergency debate. This would allow them to take control of parliamentary business and introduce that bill attempting to stop a no-deal Brexit. But even if they do succeed, they won't have much time because Parliament could be prorogued or suspended by the government as soon as next Monday, that's September the 9th. But it might not even get that far, and our political editor Robert Puston joins us now from Downing Street. Robert, just how close are we to the possibility of a general election?
Very close in my view. Although the Prime Minister himself said he doesn't want a general election, my sources close to Boris Johnson tell me that he will view just tomorrow's vote on whether backbench MPs will take control of Commons business, of the Commons order paper, as a vote of confidence. And if Boris Johnson loses, he will then, on Wednesday, ask the Commons to vote on dissolving Parliament and for an election on October the 14th. Now, this would be actually almost unique in modern times. It would be a general election on a Monday. It is the date that he currently wishes to have his Queen's speech, and he is setting it for October the 14th because it is just 3 days before the EU leaders are set to meet, and he wants to be able to go to that EU Council meeting with a new mandate from the British people to take the UK out with a no-deal Brexit unless they drop that backstop which he hates. But this is high stakes, hugely risky stuff. He can't be guaranteed of winning a general election. It will be bitterly fought if it happens. Now, just a day or so ago, I said we were on the cusp of a historic few days. I now take the view that we are on the cusp of a historic 24 hours. Boris Johnson may get the mandate he seeks to continue in office, or he could be one of the shortest prime ministers in office of all time.
OK, Robert Peston in Downing Street, thank you.
Standing in this street less than an hour ago, Boris Johnson declared that there are no circumstances in which he would ask Brussels to delay Brexit. He warned Conservative backbench MPs, some of whom were serving in the cabinet until this summer, that if they vote with the opposition for what he said would be yet another pointless delay, they would chop the legs from under his negotiations with the EU. He said he didn't want an election, but he didn't explain what he would do if he loses in the Commons this week. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, joins us right now. Gary.
Well, why, you might be wondering, was Boris Johnson emphasising this point, I will not seek a delay? And it's because of the bill that Tory rebels with opposition parties, we now have it, are planning to pass in the Commons, starting the whole process tomorrow. And in this bill, there is a post-dated letter, effectively, for Boris Johnson to sign, little gap left for his signature, in which, if they win and there is no deal, he is required to ask the EU, sign on the dotted line for an extension of the Brexit date up to the 31st of January. And if the EU turns around and says, actually, do you know what, mate, we want to push that back a lot further, after 2 days, he's got to say yes to that as well. So this is a horror show as far as hardline Brexiteers are concerned. And what he's decided to do in response to it is to table a motion in the House of Commons saying, if this passes, then we will move to the process which could trigger an early general election. That motion would require, under the laws that were passed by David Cameron and the coalition, would require 2/3 of MPs to support that. So the bulk of the opposition parties need to come on side. And that is a question that they're going to be scratching their heads about, because as you were talking to Tony Blair earlier, Tony Blair was saying in his speech today, any early election is a massive trap. But I think, given that the date that the government seem to be thinking about is a date in the first half of October, just before the European Council, which would decide whether there is a deal that can be changed from the one Theresa May negotiated, because the date is there just ahead of the European Council, it's going to be very hard for the Labour leader, reluctant as he might be, or some around him might be, to walk away from that snap election if Boris Johnson puts the motion down. Of course, Theresa May, the last occupant of this building, knows snap elections can go extremely badly. But right now, at this moment, we could be looking at another one.
Demonstrators at the end of Downing Street slightly through Boris Johnson's delivery. With his message delivered after an emergency cabinet, Tory rebels must not join forces with opposition MPs to force another delay on the Brexit date.
To show our friends in Brussels that we are united in our purpose, MPs should vote with the government against Corbyn's pointless delay. I want everybody to know there are no circumstances in which I will ask Brussels to delay.
So what would he do if Parliament passed a bill this week requiring him to demand another delay on Brexit? All signs point to him trying to call an election instead. He was determined to plant the blame for that, if it happens, on his opponents.
Let's let our negotiators get on with their work without that sword of Damocles over their necks and without an election. Without an election. I don't want an election. You don't want an election. Let's get on with the people's agenda.
Jeremy Corbyn has opposed any general election date that allows no deal to happen in the middle of it. But if the election is before the Brexit date, he may feel he has to back it. His Brexit election pledge: Labour will give you a second referendum.
In that election, Labour will give people the chance to take back control and have the final say in a public vote with credible options on both sides, including the option to remain.
At the heart of any Tory election strategy will be winning Brexit Party voters over. And only last week, the Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage said he might stand aside to help a Boris Johnson-led Tory party if it was committed to no deal.
Together, we'd be unstoppable, and Boris would have a huge majority and go down as one of the great heroes in British history.
Some long-standing Tories think Boris Johnson could win with Brexit Party support, but the party's identity would change forever.
They are aping Nigel Farage, and they are now absolutely single-minded that they're going to kick him out of the way by becoming him. Now, of course, ultimately, that doesn't kick him out of the way, it just puts him in charge. And all of the people like me and Ruth Davidson and David Gauke and Rory Stewart and Antoinette Sandbach, who supported a modern, compassionate, progressive version of conservatism, will have to look for a new home and a new place to put our votes.
Only 2 months ago, they were attending Cabinet. Today, Boris Johnson said these and other former ministers who vote for a Brexit extension could be thrown out of the party.
I do worry about where the Conservative Party might be going. There was a piece in one of the national newspapers recently calling for a purge of people like me. A senior former cabinet minister endorsed this. I didn't see the party chairman refute it. This is not good. It's not where a political, broad-based party ought to be.
Tony Blair today warned Jeremy Corbyn to oppose any early election plans, as they were an elephant trap that would hurt Labour and pro-Europeans.
But my bet is the Brexit Party will collapse them. The Labour Party at present will struggle. A resurgent Lib Dems will do well, but not well enough to govern. The opposition vote, therefore, is going to split. And under our system, that delivers a comfortable Tory majority.
Thank you.
The number 10 team hopes Tony Blair's election punditry is right. Some Tory MPs who gathered in the number 10 garden believe they could be fighting for re-election within days. The risk would be another snap election, producing a hung parliament and Brexit still in limbo.
Well, joining us now is the Conservative MP Antoinette Sandbach, who is just outside the House of Commons. Antoinette Sandbach, you are going to vote for the Hillary Benn bill. You'll also vote against a snap election. That is, in a sense, signing the death warrant on your Conservative ambitions of ever continuing as an MP.
Yes, it is, but I'm elected to act in the best interests of my constituents, many of whose jobs are on the line with a no-deal Brexit. The International Trade Observatory estimates 80,000 job losses in the northwest, and key northwest sectors, car manufacturing, chemicals industry, nuclear industry and pharmaceuticals, will be hit by a no-deal Brexit.
Now, do you have any sense of exactly how many people are going to support your bill?
I do have a sense, but I'm not going to disclose it, I'm afraid.
Now, you are a committed Remainer. Have you come under enormous pressure from your former colleagues?
I'm not a committed Remainer. I voted for the Prime Minister May's deal to leave the European Union on the 29th of March with the withdrawal agreement. I did that respecting the referendum result in my constituency, but I have always said that I would not support a no-deal Brexit, which is the worst possible outcome for this country.
Well, how confident are you tonight that you could just get this bill through?
Well, I very much hope that we will get this bill through, because if the Prime Minister is able to deliver a deal, and I very much hope that he does deliver a deal, then we will need a short technical extension in order to pass the legislation that's required, much of it which will be killed off by the prorogation of Parliament.
You know, he's saying that if your bill goes ahead, he will have no option but to call an election.
Well, I think he's angling for that. He's taken a very confrontational approach, both with Parliament and indeed with colleagues in his own party. And I feel that it is really important that we make this stand tomorrow.
You know, I was standing here about an hour ago, and the Prime Minister was standing at his lectern just there, and he said, if this bill becomes law, I will ignore the law.
Well, I wouldn't advise anybody to ignore the law, and it shows the importance.
But what are your options if he does?
Well, clearly he would be acting ultra vires outside his powers as Prime Minister if he ignored the law, and that's why the legislative route is so terribly important, because he could ignore motions of the House of Commons. He knows that there is no majority in the House of Commons for a no deal. In fact, there were hundreds of votes against a no deal back in the last parliamentary session.
Antoinette Sandbach, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, now, the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, has warned Jeremy Corbyn of the risk of an election, calling it an elephant trap. So I spoke to him earlier, and I began by asking him whether he would vote for Mr Corbyn if it meant stopping a no-deal Brexit.
Look, I've always said it's a struggle for me because of a whole lot of other policies of the Labour Party and because of the way the Labour Party's behaved over certain issues, particularly anti-Semitism. But I would, in an election, which I think is the wrong thing to do, but if there was an election specifically on the question of no-deal Brexit, I would do whatever is the best way of stopping no-deal Brexit, including voting Labour if that was the way to do it.
But how incredible that a former Prime Minister says that a general election, we are after all a representative democracy, is the wrong way to resolve an absolutely cataclysmic crisis.
Yeah, but it is the wrong way, because for the very reason that your first question suggests, which is a general election is an election as the government of the day, and the Brexit question will be mixed up with a whole lot of other questions. The right way to resolve Brexit is indeed to go back to the people, but you go back to the people directly on the Brexit question.
But that's not going to heal the country, is it?
Well, what else is going to heal the country? If we supposing we crash out, Parliament's circumvented, we crash out with no deal on the 31st of October, when you cannot seriously argue that June 2016 is a clear mandate for a no-deal Brexit. What do people think is going to be the state of the country after that? And supposing, by the way, even a fraction of the warnings on no-deal Brexit turn out to be correct, we could have been 6 months in a situation where there's, the country's in constitutional meltdown.
With the knowledge of having been a Prime Minister, how do you view the way our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is dealing with this?
Look, Boris Johnson's Boris Johnson, so there's a lot of vim and vigour and dash and flash and all of that. And the risk he's taking with the country is a risk that I would never, ever want to take as Prime Minister. And the one thing I think he should really do in these next few weeks is leave aside all the issues about whether he could win an election or he couldn't win an election. Just think what's going to happen if you really crash out with no deal and it turns out on the bad side of the risk spectrum.
There are many people who will have thought of you, thought of the days when your moral authority was second to none, and then look at the Iraq War and say that disables him completely.
Yeah, and if people say that, then that's their right. And I say to them, But
don't you feel today, if only I didn't have that against me, I could do something now?
In the end, what I say to people about this is you can decide whether you think I did the wrong thing and so on and so forth, and that's up to you. But this is an issue for the country I feel so strongly on. Maybe it's because I've now got grandchildren. I'm not going to have a situation where people in 20, 30 years' time turn around and say, well, what the hell were you doing? Why weren't you were Prime Minister for 10 years. You weren't telling people this was a bad idea. It's such a bad idea. I mean, I wake up every morning with this Brexit thing. sometimes in despair, sometimes in rage, and sometimes just thinking, what do we have to do? Because it's a profound historical mistake for the country. It solves nothing. It isolates us in a world where we need to be engaged. And then we are separating ourselves. And for what? You know, for this myth that Europe controls what we do. And look at all these promises Boris Johnson's making on the health service, on education, on law and order, on spending, an end to austerity. Which one of those promises depends on leaving Europe? None of them. You know, we make our decisions not in Brussels, but in Britain. And this is what's so crazy. For this distraction, we're going to pay such a heavy price for future generations. So I understand people don't want to listen to me, that's fine. But I honestly, on this, I'm going to speak. Even if I'm addressing one person, I'm going to speak.
Tony Blair, thank you very much for talking to us. Well, we did ask the government for an interview tonight with a minister, but no one was available. Gary Gibbon joins me again now. It's hotting up.
Yes, it is. And what you heard Boris Johnson do here earlier was effectively try to frame a potential early general election, frame the way it's perceived out there. Effectively, he was playing the blame game. He was saying this thing might well happen. It was all very coded. But if it is going to happen, it's because of those rebels, those Tory rebels and those Labour MPs. They're going to force this election that you, the voter, he's pretty sure voters don't like unnecessary polls, as they say it, that you, the voter, don't really want. He was trying to frame that, but the other big bit of framing that we'll move into the moment this election kicks off, because I have to say at the moment, it looks as though it will. It looks as though there are enough Tory rebels combined with opposition MPs to make this vote happen tomorrow, which will then trigger his call for an election the next day. Those MPs, the other bit of the framing that he's going to be doing is Parliament versus the people, and that, of course, we're going to hit big time the moment the election kicks off.
Can he win it if it happens?
Well, wouldn't be doing this if he didn't think he could, but we haven't seen really reliable numbers. What we have seen is a sense, you hear it talking to people in number 10, that they think the Lib Dem surge will be enough to hurt the Labour Party in LabCon marginals, and that might well, combined with the fact that they hope to sweep up huge chunks of the Brexit Party vote, that might well compensate for the fact that the Tories could be in for a bad time in Scotland, a bad time perhaps in the southwest and some other areas where the Lib Dems might actually seize seats. But it does look right now as though we are going to be testing these in reality quite soon, because the rebellion looks as though it's got the numbers tomorrow.
Gary Gibbon.